Go ahead and have a seat. We know that the biblical narrative, starting in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, from that point through Adam, Noah, to Abraham, to Isaac, to David, all of that history was pointed towards a deliverer, an ultimate lamb that would one day take away the sins of the world. And it would come through the bloodline of Joseph and Mary all the way back to Abraham. The apostles that chose to follow Jesus believed that Jesus was the Son of God. If you were to go back and you were to interview each one of the apostles before Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, probably each one would have agreed that Jesus is the soon-to-be king that has come to deliver mankind from sin and death. After all, Jesus' earthly ministry over their past 3 years accomplished the task of showing those apostles what God, who previously was invisible, was actually like. By becoming flesh, who could question the perfection in how Jesus lived and how he loved? It was miraculous. No one in human history could compare to his words and actions. And the apostles were captured by Jesus. The blind gained sight. Leprous people became clean. Demons cast out of the possessed. 5,000 fed with just a few loaves and a few fish. Paralyzed people walking. Nothing could compare. But at that point of Jesus' triumphant entry into Jerusalem, this is where the apostles miscalculated what was about to happen. You remember. Jesus instructed 2 of his disciples to borrow a colt. And then Jesus rode the colt into Jerusalem. It was the week of Passover, commemorating how the nation of Israel was spared from death by the blood of the Lamb at the hand of the Egyptians. The crowd that was gathered in Jerusalem was large. And in Mark chapter 11, verses 8 through 10, you remember the crowd waved palm branches, singing, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." And the apostles knew this was a fulfillment of Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9, predicted some 500 years earlier. The expectations of the apostles couldn't be higher. The masses were ready to follow Jesus as they hoped that he would overcome the Roman-dominated world. At that moment, I don't think any of the apostles could imagine that the public opinion could possibly turn as Jesus was then being celebrated. But what the apostles didn't understand, Jesus didn't come to establish a temporal kingdom by defeating the religious or by defeating the Romans. Jesus had his sights much higher. Jesus came to destroy sin so that his eternal kingdom could be established. To accomplish that, Jesus knew he must die to pay the penalty for mankind's sins. Jesus knew from the get-go, Jesus knew he came to die. Jesus knew he was the unblemished lamb that would take away the sins of the world. Jesus knew no other sacrifice could satisfy the wrath of God. You could argue that the apostles should have known what was coming. I mean, the Old Testament narrative didn't hide the fact that there was a penalty that needed to be paid for sin. The apostles, though, were blinded from what they should have believed by what they wanted to believe. They wanted to believe that Jesus would rise to power without pain and suffering, and that he would get to share, they would get to share in this earthly triumph with Jesus. That's what they wanted. And because of what they wanted to happen, the apostles grew increasingly confused through the course of the week. Confusion probably began to set in at the place we call the upper room. I want to show you a map of the city of Jerusalem. Now, as we look at this city of Jerusalem, all the events that took place in those final 24 hours of his life took place in this small little area. You think it's a huge city. From one side of the city to the other is no more than half a mile. So you could cover a lot of ground from going from one area to the other. And we see in the lower southwest corner, there's a place called the Upper Room. And let me take you on a purview of where they would go from place to place to place. They would go from the Upper Room, and then they would go to the southern steps of the temple. And then they would go to from the southern steps of the temple, they would go over here to this garden called the Garden of Gethsemane. From there, they would go back to the fortress of Antonio, and then all the way over here to Caiaphas's house, where he would have a mock trial. We'll cover that in a second. From there, he would go back to the fortress of Antonio. From there, he would go back, after being seen by Pilate, back over to Herod, back to the fortress of Antonio, where he would be declared, he would be sentenced to death. And from there, he would travel north, carrying his cross to Golgotha. Through the course of their week, their confusion began to rise. So in that upper room, let's go back to that upper room, because in that upper room, two things happened. The first was Jesus' lesson on how to minister, because Jesus knew he would shortly go to the cross, but he still wanted to carve his initials into the souls of these apostles. And so the first thing that happened is Jesus showed them how to minister. He did that by washing their feet. Well, how did that do it? Well, there was a lesson on how to serve people. You serve people where they are most vulnerable. No, he didn't mean to go around the rest of your life taking a bowl with soapy water and washing people's feet. But what happens is people, the feet, represent the areas of their life that they're most vulnerable. And by washing feet, it says, I love you still. I'm not ashamed of the things that you are most embarrassed by. The second thing in that upper room, he established a visual aid for what was about to come. Jesus reenacted what he was about to go through on the cross. He took bread, which was unleavened bread. It was pierced and it was striped, and it represented his body that would soon be broken. He had wine that represented the blood that he would shed as God's covenant agreement with his followers. And a covenant agreement is unbreakable. This was the only celebration of communion prior to Jesus' death. There was something similar to communion in the Old Testament. It was called the Feast of Unleavened Bread, but it celebrated Passover, as they were delivered from death, and the firstborn of every house of the Egyptians would die. But this meal in the upper room is describing a bigger Passover. Every time from that point on that communion was celebrated, after that, it was after Jesus' death. After, it's easy to see what the Lord's table represented. After Jesus died, the bread equals the body, the wine equals the blood. But before Jesus went to the cross, the apostles just didn't quite connect the dots. They'd been exposed to the Old Testament. The apostles knew the Old Testament. They had read Psalm 22 that talked about what the Messiah would do on the cross. They had heard Jesus himself talk about, just like Jonah was in the belly of the whale for 3 days, so I will be in the belly of the earth for 3 days. But they couldn't see it. You know, I get it. I remember in the early 80s, a friend of mine left what he was doing and he joined a startup company. And what he was doing is he was helping start this thing called electronic mail. And for me, it was up at that time, I thought, mail, pen, paper, stamp, truck, deliverer. And now all of a sudden you're going to type a message into this piece of machinery and it's going to be stored. And I was thinking, where are these mailboxes? Well, they're in the electronic world, and I just couldn't see it. And I thought to myself, that's never going to happen. I think the apostles couldn't picture what Jesus was talking about when he talked about that he came to die. I don't think they wanted to believe it. It didn't fit into their created narrative, and I think they thought, oh, that's Jesus suffering and dying. It's never going to happen. Now we go back to that map, and from the upper room, then Jesus journeyed with his apostles to the southern steps of the temple. It was only about a third of a mile. It wasn't very long. And there on the southern steps of the temple in John chapter 17, these steps became Jesus' classroom. As Jesus prays to the Father on the apostles' behalf, he prays for them that the Father would protect and preserve them, that they would one day share in his glory. Jesus is thinking eternally. His apostles, though, are still thinking temporal. Then it describes in chapter 18, they crossed the Kidron Valley. You see the Kidron Valley running kind of the east side of the city of Jerusalem. You remember it was Passover time, where everybody would bring an unblemished lamb to the slaughter, and they would slay the lamb. The blood would be drained from the lamb, and it represented that their sins would be paid for that year, but they had to keep doing it. That blood had to go someplace, and it would drain from the temple down into the Kidron Valley. The Kidron Valley, there was a little creek that ran through that area. And when your Jesus walked from the southern steps across that Kidron Valley up to the Garden of Gethsemane, that water that he walked through was stained with the blood of the lambs from the temple, because that's where it's drained, and his sandals would have been stained with the red blood, representing he was the ultimate lamb who would be slain. He went over to the garden. All his apostles, by this time it's getting late. Jesus prayed, and they slept. He's thinking, can't you guys even stay awake for a little bit with me? And then was the arrest. You see over here in the top here, the Antonio Fortress, the fortress of Antonio. That's where the Roman soldiers were housed. Through the assistance of Judas and the Sanhedrin and the high priests, they came to arrest Jesus. The only way they would have known he was there is if Judas would have sold him out. And so 300 soldiers, a Roman cohort, leave the fortress of Antonio. They come down to the temple and they walk on that little snake path out to the garden. In John chapter 18, it says that they came with torches. It was dark. The apostles are asleep in the garden. Jesus is awake. He knows his arrest is coming. He walks out of the garden, and you've got 300 soldiers walking down a snake path to come to arrest him. And Jesus goes out to meet him. You need to understand something. At no time was Jesus out of control. Jesus orchestrated his arrest. And Jesus walked out in the darkness as they're coming down, 300 soldiers with torches, and he says to them, "Whom do you seek?" One of them says, "We seek Jesus the Nazarene." And Jesus said, "I am he." He's quoting Deuteronomy that he is God. And when he said, "I am he," 300 soldiers, it says, drew back and fell to the ground. Read it sometime. It's in John chapter 18. It's a wrestling term. It's like a fireman's carry. When Jesus said, "I am he," 300 trained soldiers were picked up and thrown to their backs. Jesus was in control of his arrest. They get up, and then Jesus once again says, "Whom do you seek?" And I'm thinking, at that point in time, those guys, the 300 soldiers in the line, were like, "Don't say it." And somebody said, "Well, Jesus the Nazarene?" This time, Jesus didn't throw them on their backside. He said, "I am he." They came. They arrested him. First, Jesus went to Annas and Caiaphas' house. You need to understand something. Annas was the high priest, and you had a high priest for the Sanhedrin. He was high priest for life. Caiaphas was his son-in-law. The Romans didn't want the high priest to be in office forever. And so they said, you've got to rotate who's the high priest. So Annas was always the high priest, but he assigned Caiaphas, who was one of his son-in-laws, to kind of be it at that time. So there were two high priests. Jesus is brought before Annas and Caiaphas. In Matthew chapter 26, verses 57 through 68, it says, as they put him on trial, 7 of the Sanhedrin rules were broken. The first was this: they met in the middle of the night. That was the first rule broken. The Sanhedrin, if they put somebody on trial, they had to meet in the light of the day where the masses could come and see it, but they're meeting in the middle of the night. First rule broken. The second rule that was broken is you had to have 2 eyewitnesses in perfect harmony with one another, and their 2 witnesses were in disagreement with one another. The third rule was the Sanhedrin, the 23 priests, the 23 elders, the 23 scribes, and the 2 high priests were the defense attorneys. They were not allowed to accuse somebody who was on trial, and yet the third law was being broken because they weren't being the defense attorneys, they were being the accusers. The fourth rule that was broken, found in verse 62, is the high priest were not supposed to demand a criminal who was being tried to respond. And so when Jesus was quiet at his accusations, Jesus was holding them to their rules. The fourth law was broken. The fifth was, they said, we don't have any need for witnesses. We'll throw out the need for witnesses. Well, yeah, your law says you need to have witnesses. They broke their fifth rule. The sixth rule they broke was when you voted on whether someone was guilty or not, if the vote was unanimous, it was thrown out of their puppet court. It was a unanimous decision. It should have been thrown out. Because it said if it was unanimous, somebody wasn't thinking critically. The seventh rule they broke is the Sanhedrin were not allowed to touch anyone who was being tried in their court. And yet, they didn't not only touched him, they walked down and stood in line and they beat him. This was a lynch mob. And in the apostles' confusion, Peter denies knowing Jesus. Judas takes his own life. Jesus is then taken before Pilate, going back to the fortress of Antonia. Pilate doesn't know what to do with him. Pilate sends him over to Herod, where you see the west side of the city, over to Herod's palace. Herod doesn't know what to do with him. Neither one finds grounds for crucifixion. And then Jesus is brought back to Pilate. Nobody knows what to do with him, and Pilate had Jesus flogged. And still Pilate, wanting to get this off his plate, gave the Jews a choice, because you see it was Passover and they had a ritual. You choose one prisoner to go free. And the Sanhedrin persuaded the masses to choose Barabbas, who was guilty of sedition. And so the masses, the people, chose Jesus to be crucified instead of Barabbas. Jesus died in the place of sinners. The crowds 1 week earlier, you remember, they waved palm branches singing, Hosanna! And now they're yelling, crucify. Jesus is sentenced to death. He's led to the cross. The cross is just north of the city. You see where Golgotha is. He's led to the cross. It's 9 a.m. He will hang on the cross till 3 p.m. From noon until 3 p.m., the sky turned eerily dark. And John records in John chapter 19, verse 30, Jesus declares, it is finished. It was a battle cry. Battle won, debt paid. And simultaneous to that, The curtain in the temple that separated God from man was torn in two, because Jesus enables us to have access into his kingdom.